Today we tend to think of ancient buildings as the primitive structures of the past, but are they really? Of course, today our progress grows and grows, and with it our houses, whose roofs soaring upwards. Sometimes when we look at the buildings of the past, we don't even understand the principle of their construction, or their design, which goes back a long way. But what is hidden there? What secrets these majestic monuments of the past keep? Let's find out. Sometimes, passing by old buildings, we are amazed by their precision and elegance, which today have been replaced by simplicity and cheapness, only going into the economic benefits of construction. But the buildings of the past surprise us not only with their scale, but also with their history. After all, there is a huge number of buildings, the real age of which we sometimes do not know, as well as the principle of construction. Today I want to understand the history of all of us known construction, lighthouse, the principle of operation of which, it would seem, is known to all, but is it so? What were they really built for? First we will study the history, which is presented to us, and then, already at the end of the video, look at the photos, which quite give reason to think, and whether everything is as they tell us, and why the construction of a large-scale lighthouse, the Statue of Liberty, never reached its culmination. Lighthouses date back to ancient times, when their prototypes were bonfires on coastal hills. In the distant past, lighthouse was a landmark for naval frigates. It helped sailors to navigate on the terrain, and only today the meaning of lighthouses is not relevant at all, replaced by digitalization. But perhaps it is not only about modern navigation, but about the very meaning of these huge structures that have lost their true purpose, lost their relevance in our world. Lighthouses have been built in every corner of the world. Imagine, the first lighthouse was built before our era, Alexandria Lighthouse. It was the tallest structure in the world, at the level of the Egyptian pyramids. According to various estimates, its height reached up to 150 meters. Imagine the scale of this construction now. The size is colossal, and still need to maintain the level to make the foundation for centuries or even for tens of centuries ahead. And all this was built before our era. But under strange circumstances, this monumental structure suffered a sad fate. No, it was not destroyed by raids. It was not washed away by a huge wave. The lighthouse, destroyed by an earthquake. Imagine. It withstood the force of the water element for 17 centuries. It stood firm, but from the earthquake it collapsed. What kind of cataclysmic force would it take to destroy a tower of that size? Of course, the history of this lighthouse is far in the past, as well as the real meaning of its construction and destruction. Well, many lighthouses to this day remember a very curious story. Earlier, before the advent of electricity, according to the official history, lighthouses transmitted a light signal only through a fire, tossed wood and coal. But you can imagine what it's like to build a fire on top of a lighthouse. The fire has to be maintained somehow. Bring wood, store it in a dry place, and sometimes lighthouses are in the clear sea, far away from civilization. And the farther away the lighthouse is, the stronger the signal fire should be, and therefore the bigger the fire, and the fire needs to be burning all the time, so as not to be lost from sight. But the problem is that a constantly burning lighthouse fire has the disadvantage that it can be confused with a star, or just with a residential building on the shore. It's quite interesting how they managed to build huge fires on top of the lighthouse, in the sea. But the bigger question is that these tons of firewood had to be delivered to the lighthouse somehow, and everywhere, and what did they use to deliver them? Boats on the sea. Here, for example, is a lighthouse on Sakhalin. The lighthouse is located in an extremely inaccessible place, a lot of currents and difficult weather conditions. Its construction dates back to the 19th century. It is even hard to imagine how it was built. On an oval concrete base stands directly the lighthouse and an annex. For those times when it was built, the lighthouse could be called a giant, 9 floors, and even a dome. And sometimes, lighthouses were built right in the sea, in deep water, near the reefs. In 1699, the first lighthouse of its kind was built in the middle of the sea, surrounded on all sides by water. This is what its story tells. It was an octagonal tower, at the top of which was a room with glass windows. Candles burned in it to illuminate the sailors. It is strange. Some sources say one thing, others another, but not both. Does not fit with common sense. Then there's a full-blown fire upstairs. Then there's a few candles. At night it all just merges into a huge starry sky. But still, how did they transmit a signal for hundreds of kilometers? And the very question of building lighthouses in remote antiquity right in the sea strikes the imagination. How people lowered the foundation into the water, delivered building material, and storms, which at one time can demolish all unfinished construction. What kind of knowledge one must have to design such large-scale towers right in the sea, where loads can be simply colossal? Maybe there were no alternatives and the only solution was to build only such a large-scale structure. No, there were alternatives. There were floating lighthouses, which performed their functions no worse, and much cheaper and easier to build than these huge towers. But still, what were they built for? Let's take a closer look at the names of lighthouses. Have you noticed that many lighthouses are called towers? Sea Tower, Maiden Tower, Tower of Hercules. Of course, it's worth realizing that they can all be renamed to make adjustments in the right direction. But what was my surprise when I learned that many modern lighthouses were military fortifications. Here, for example, is Hercules Tower. Now it is the oldest operating lighthouse in the world, but originally this structure wasn't a lighthouse at all. I think the name speaks for itself. But could a defense tower be a lighthouse? Or vice versa? It could have been, because the Roman lighthouse at Dover is a ruined Roman tower from the 1st century yet. If it didn't say it was a lighthouse, you wouldn't think it was a lighthouse, just a tower with a fortress in the background. Sometimes many buildings just lose the prefix to the word lighthouse. Look at this tower in the desert. Doesn't it remind you of anything? Roman lighthouse, the tower we just looked at. But for some reason they don't call them lighthouses, but just abandoned structures. It's strange. All towers by the sea suddenly started to be called lighthouses, and it doesn't matter whether it's a defensive structure or a bell tower for monks. It's simple, by the sea means lighthouse. But for some reason they kept silent about such towers. But why build a tower or a lighthouse right on the edge of a huge quarry? Maybe it is only now we see the quarry, and not so long ago this building could rise right above the surface of the water, and then the water just receded or dried up. Studying old photos, I came across one very interesting find, an Alba lighthouse. Here it is nowadays. At first glance, nothing remarkable. A lighthouse is just a lighthouse, and here's a photo of the 19th century. You can see that over the years the construction has completely changed. The house next to it is missing. And look at the top of the lighthouse, that tall spire. What do you think it was there for? Maybe it was a tower. Add to that the fact that lighthouses were built in the era of the development of modern high-voltage stations. That seems pretty far-fetched. But look at this lighthouse. Yeah, that's a lighthouse. Doesn't it remind you of anything? This is the 19th century Shukov Tower, and this is a modern radio tower. And another strange coincidence is that towers are sometimes built in the suburbs, so that the signal is clear and not interrupted by houses. Terrain. They are built away from people, like lighthouses. And finally, I'd like to tell you about the Statue of Liberty. Perhaps few people know, but this structure was built originally as a lighthouse. But the history of the statue with its symbolism, history, begins a very long time ago. After all, we all know the Statue of Liberty in America. But did you know that there are similar monuments all over the world? They are in France, Japan, and even in Lviv. There are for statues in Paris alone. They didn't even think of making lighthouses there. It's just a monument. A monument. But to whom? Why did they start erecting these statues so recently? For what purpose? A symbol of American freedom, you say? What about Japan? What about Lvov? What's the connection? And I wonder why America decided to cover all this with the construction of the lighthouse. Because from the very beginning it was clear that such a structure is not capable of serving for illumination. Yes, in the role of a lighthouse, having worked for a short time, it did not justify itself at all. The light was barely visible even a few kilometers away. Engineers offered different variants of improvement of the construction, from installation of new equipment to covering the Statue of Liberty with gilding. But the authorities didn't need it. They were satisfied with a monument without a lighthouse. It seems that it has its own significance in history. It doesn't. It's just that technically this statue was given the role of a lighthouse, just covering up all the unnecessary problems with the erection.